Snow blanketed the village of Frostwood, muffling every sound. By December, the sun barely rose over the horizon, leaving the streets in an eerie twilight that clung to the edges of the forest. Frostwood wasn't the kind of place you'd find on a map. Hidden in a valley surrounded by towering pines, it existed in its own world, untouched by the chaos of the cities beyond. The villagers liked it that way. They kept to themselves, living by traditions passed down through generations. But there was one tradition that no one ever spoke about. A rule whispered in the dark: never ring the bells at Christmas. I didn't grow up in Frostwood. My parents moved away before I was born, and they rarely spoke of the village. "It's not for you," my father once said when I asked why we never visited for the holidays. That was the end of it. But last year, everything changed. My grandmother died in early December, and I was the only one left to settle her affairs. My father refused to return, his face pale and tight when I mentioned it. "Do what you have to do," he said, "but don't stay longer than you need to." I arrived on a clear, bitterly cold morning. Frostwood looked like something out of a postcard. Quaint cottages with smoking chimneys, garlands of holly draped over doorways, and snow-dusted fir trees lining the cobblestone streets. It was charming, almost too perfect, but there was a heaviness in the air that I couldn't shake. The villagers watched me as I parked my car outside my grandmother's cottage. Their eyes lingered too long, their expressions wary. No one smiled. The cottage was smaller than I remembered from childhood visits. It smelled faintly of lavender and something metallic, a scent I couldn't place. The fireplace was cold, the furniture covered in white sheets, and the air felt heavy, as if the house itself were holding its breath. On the kitchen table, I found a note in my grandmother's handwriting. "Welcome home. Light the candles, but do not touch the bells. No matter what you hear, no matter what happens, do not touch the bells." That night, I couldn't sleep. The silence was oppressive, the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, when I heard it. A faint, rhythmic sound, like the chiming of distant bells. I sat up, my pulse quickening. The sound was soft, almost melodic, but there was something wrong about it. It wasn't coming from outside, it was coming from inside the house. I grabbed my flashlight and crept downstairs, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound grew louder as I reached the kitchen, where a cabinet door swung open slightly, revealing a small brass bell hanging from a red ribbon. It wasn't there when I'd arrived. I slammed the cabinet shut and stepped back, my breath clouding in the freezing air. The sound stopped instantly, leaving the house in silence once more. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I decided to explore the village. I needed answers, though I wasn't sure what I was looking for. The streets were quiet, the villagers polite but distant. No one mentioned my grandmother or offered condolences. It was as if her death was something to be ignored. At the edge of the village, I found a small church, its steeple rising above the trees. The doors were locked, but I could see a large bell hanging in the tower, its bronze surface tarnished with age. "Don't go near the bells." I turned to see an elderly man standing a few feet away, his face pale beneath his thick scarf. "Excuse me?" I said. "The bells," he repeated, his voice trembling. "They don't like to be disturbed?" "Who doesn't?" He shook his head and turned to leave, his hunched figure disappearing down the path before I could ask anything else. That evening, I sat by the fire, poring over my grandmother's belongings. Most of it was ordinary, photographs, letters, and recipes, written in her careful handwriting. But in a wooden chest at the back of her closet, I found something that made my blood run cold. It was a collection of bells, each one different in size and shape. Some were simple brass, others ornate with intricate carvings. But what unnerved me most was that each bell was labeled with a name: Martha, Thomas, Abigail. And beneath each bell was a date ranging from decades ago to just a few years earlier. The sound of bells woke me again that night. This time it was louder, more insistent. It filled the house, echoing through the halls like a choir of ghosts. I grabbed the flashlight and ran downstairs, expecting to find the cabinet open again, but it wasn't. The sound wasn't coming from inside the house, it was coming from the forest. I hesitated at the door, my grandmother's warning echoing in my mind: do not touch the bells, but the sound was growing louder, pulling at me like a siren's call. I couldn't stop myself. I threw on my coat and stepped outside, the icy air biting at my skin. The forest was darker than I expected, the trees blocking out what little moonlight there was. The bells grew louder as I walked, their sound rhythmic and hypnotic. I didn't know where I was going, but my feet seemed to move on their own. I reached a clearing, and my breath caught in my throat. In the center of the clearing stood a massive tree, its gnarled branches twisted into unnatural shapes. Hanging from the branches were dozens of bells, their ribbons swaying in the windless air. The sound was deafening now, a cacophony of chimes that seemed to pierce straight into my mind. Beneath the tree, a figure knelt in the snow. It was a woman, her hair long and dark, her face hidden in her hands. Her shoulders shook as if she were sobbing, but I couldn't hear her over the bells. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling. The woman froze. Slowly, she lifted her head, and my blood turned to ice. Her eyes were hollow, dark voids that seemed to swallow the light. Her mouth twisted into a smile, her teeth sharp and unnatural. "Why did you come here?" she whispered, her voice like the wind through the trees. I stumbled back, my heart racing. I don't know." She stood slowly, the bells falling silent as she moved. The forest seemed to hold its breath. "You shouldn't have come," she said, taking a step toward me. I turned and ran, the sound of her laughter chasing me through the trees. When I reached the cottage, I locked the door behind me and collapsed onto the floor, gasping for air. The bells were silent now, but the image of the woman's hollow eyes and jagged smile was burned into my mind. I knew then that the stories about Frostwood were true. The bells were cursed, and I had broken the rule. And now, I didn't know if I could stop what was coming. The next morning, the village was unusually quiet, even for Frostwood. The snowfall from the night before had blanketed everything in pristine white, but it did little to mask the uneasy stillness that seemed to hang in the air. I hadn't slept. The memory of the woman in the forest, her hollow eyes, her sharp smile, was burned into my mind. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the brass bell from the cabinet. It looked harmless enough, yet I couldn't bring myself to touch it. My grandmother's warning echoed in my mind. Do not touch the bells. I needed answers, but I didn't know where to start. The villagers had been wary of me since I arrived, and the one man who'd tried to explain Mr. Carter had vanished. Still, I couldn't ignore what was happening. The bells, the names, the woman in the forest, it was all connected. And somehow, my grandmother had known. I decided to visit the church. The snow crunched beneath my boots as I made my way through the village. Frostwood looked beautiful in the daylight, its cottages dusted with snow, smoke curling from their chimneys. But the beauty felt like a mask, hiding something darker beneath. The church stood at the edge of the village, its steeple towering over the trees. The bell tower cast a long shadow over the snow, and the sight of it sent a chill down my spine. I pushed open the heavy wooden doors and stepped inside. The air was cold and still, the faint scent of incense lingering. The interior was simple, rows of wooden pews, a stone altar, and stained glass windows depicting scenes from the Bible. But my attention was drawn to the far corner, where a large brass bell hung suspended from a wooden frame. It was smaller than the one in the tower, but identical in design, its surface tarnished and scratched. As I approached, I noticed something carved into the base. "Those who ring the bell shall bear the weight of their sin." Looking for something? I spun around, startled, to see an elderly woman standing in the doorway. She was bundled in a thick coat, her sharp eyes fixed on me. "I'm sorry," I stammered. "I didn't mean to intrude." She stepped closer, her gaze never leaving mine. "You're the girl from the cottage," she said. "Yes," I said hesitantly. "My grandmother." "Your grandmother knew better," the woman said, her voice cutting. "She kept to the rules. But you've stirred the bells." "What does that mean?" I asked, my voice trembling. The woman's expression softened, but only slightly. "The bells are not ordinary," she said. "They are bound to the forest, to the curse that haunts this village. When you ring them, you awaken something that should stay asleep." I thought of the cabinet, the bells hanging from the tree, and the woman in the clearing. "Who is she?" I asked. The woman's face darkened. "She is the consequence," she said. "The price we pay for sins long forgotten. The bells are her chains, and every time they ring, she grows stronger." "Why does she want me?" "Because you rang the bell," the woman said simply. "And now she won't stop until she has what she wants." I left the church with more questions than answers. The woman's words had chilled me to the core, but they didn't explain everything. What sins was she talking about? And why had my grandmother kept the bells hidden? Back at the cottage, I rummaged through my grandmother's belongings, searching for anything that might help. It was in the same chest where I'd found the labeled bells that I discovered a journal, its leather cover cracked and worn. Inside were pages of cramped handwriting detailing the village's history. The entries were disjointed, written as though my grandmother had been piecing together a puzzle. The forest was here long before the village, and it will be here long after. The first settlers spoke of voices in the trees, of shadows that moved when no one was watching. But it wasn't until they built the church that the bells began to ring. The bells were meant to protect us, to ward off whatever lurked in the forest. But the first winter, the children disappeared. One by one, they vanished, leaving only their footprints in the snow. That was when they found her, frozen beneath the ice of the lake. No one knows who she was or where she came from, but when they pulled her body from the water, the bells rang on their own. That was the beginning. The journal trailed off, the last few pages smeared with ink. My hands trembled as I closed it, my mind racing. The woman in the forest, was she the one they'd found in the lake? Had the bells somehow bound her to this place? As the sun dipped below the horizon, I felt a growing sense of dread. The forest seemed to press closer to the cottage, its shadows stretching toward the windows. I tried to busy myself with chores, but the sound of bells began to fill my ears, faint and distant at first, but growing louder with each passing moment. I knew I shouldn't go outside. I knew I should stay inside and wait for it to pass, but the sound was relentless, pulling at me like a thread, unraveling a tapestry. I grabbed my coat and stepped into the snow, the cold biting at my skin. The bells were louder now, their rhythmic chime echoing through the trees. My feet moved on their own, carrying me toward the forest. The clearing was darker this time, the massive tree looming like a shadow against the sky. The bells hanging from its branches swayed gently, though there was no wind. And beneath the tree, she was waiting. The woman stood with her back to me, her dark hair cascading over her shoulders. Her pale skin seemed to glow in the moonlight, and the air around her was bitterly cold. "You came back," she said without turning. "I don't want to be here," I said, my voice trembling. "But you are," she said, her tone almost amused. She turned slowly, and I felt my breath catch in my throat. Her eyes were hollow voids, her smile sharp and cruel. "Why are you doing this?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She tilted her head, studying me. "Because you called me," she said. "You rang the bell and now you must pay the price." "What do you want?" Her smile widened. "Balance." I didn't understand what she meant, but before I could ask, the bells fell silent. The forest grew impossibly still, and the air seemed to thrum with energy. "You've disturbed the chain," she said, stepping closer. "Now we begin." The ground beneath me trembled, and the tree's branches creaked as though under some great weight. The bells began to chime again, their sound louder and more chaotic than before. The woman raised her hand, and shadows began to spill from the tree, pooling at her feet. They twisted and writhed, taking on forms that were almost human, but not quite. "Run," she said, her voice a mixture of delight and malice. I didn't need to be told twice. I turned and ran, the sound of the bells and the shadows chasing me through the trees. My heart pounded in my chest as I stumbled over roots and dodged low-hanging branches. When I finally burst out of the forest and into the village, I collapsed in the snow, gasping for air. The bells had stopped, and the shadows were gone. But I knew it wasn't over. It was only just beginning. The village was different the next day. The snow that had fallen in pristine, undisturbed blankets was now streaked with strange, dark patterns, shadows that seemed to ripple even under the sunlight. The people of Frostwood were quieter than usual, their expressions tense. Doors stayed closed and windows were shuttered tightly, as if everyone were waiting for something to happen. I could feel it too, a weight in the air, pressing down on everything, suffocating. It was as if the bells that had rung through the forest the night before had left behind an echo that refused to fade. My hands shook as I opened my grandmother's journal again. The entries were scattered, but one line seemed to leap off the page. "The bells demand balance. For every life they protect, another must be taken." What did that mean? Protect from what? And who decided whose life was taken? The day dragged on, every sound making me jump. I tried to convince myself that it was over, that whatever had happened in the forest last night had ended when I escaped. But deep down, I knew better. It wasn't over. I was still sitting at the kitchen table when the first knock came. It was faint at first, barely audible over the wind, but it grew louder, more insistent. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The knock came again, followed by a voice. "Clara." I recognized it immediately. It was my grandmother's voice. "Clara, open the door." I stood slowly, my legs trembling beneath me. It couldn't be her. She was gone. I had buried her. "Clara," the voice called again, more urgent now. "Let me in." I moved toward the door, my heart pounding. I don't know why I did it. I don't know what I expected to find on the other side. I reached for the handle, but hesitated. "Who are you?" I whispered. The voice didn't answer. Instead, the knocking stopped, replaced by a deep, heavy silence. I waited, my hand hovering over the handle, but the door remained still. Finally, I forced myself to step back, my chest heaving with shallow breaths. That night, the bells returned. They were louder this time, their chime reverberating through the house like a living thing. I lay in bed, clutching the covers tightly, trying to block out the sound. But it was no use. The bells were inside me now, their rhythm matching the frantic beating of my heart. I didn't want to go outside. I knew what waited for me in the forest. But as the bells grew louder, I felt the pull again, that invisible thread that seemed to wrap around my chest and drag me toward the trees. I didn't even realize I was moving until I found myself standing at the edge of the forest, the snow crunching beneath my boots. The bells called to me, guiding me deeper into the darkness. This time, the clearing was different. The massive tree was still there, its branches heavy with bells that swayed without wind. But the woman was not alone. Figures stood around her, dozens of them, their forms twisted and indistinct, as if they were made of smoke and shadow. Their hollow eyes gleamed in the dim light, and their heads turned in unison as I stepped into the clearing. "You returned," the woman said, her voice both amused and triumphant. "I didn't have a choice," I said, my voice shaking. "You always have a choice," she said, taking a step closer. "But it's too late now. The bells have chosen you." "Chosen me for what?" "For balance," she said. "You don't understand," she said softly. "The bells have already chosen. If you refuse, they will take what they want." The shadows surged forward, and I felt their icy touch on my skin. My vision blurred, and I collapsed to my knees, gasping for air. The bells rang louder, their sound vibrating through my bones. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to stop it. And then, through the haze of sound and shadows, I heard a voice. Clara. It was faint, almost drowned out by the bells, but it was unmistakable. My grandmother's voice, calling to me from somewhere deep within the forest. I forced myself to my feet, the shadows clawing at me as I stumbled toward the sound. My grandmother's voice grew louder, guiding me through the darkness until I reached the edge of the clearing. There, in the distance, I saw her. She stood beneath another tree, her figure illuminated by a soft, golden light. "Come to me," she said, her voice steady and calm. I didn't hesitate. I ran toward her, the shadows and the bells fading behind me. When I reached her, she took my hand, her touch warm and comforting. "You must finish what I started," she said. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice trembling. She looked at me, her expression both sad and resolute. "The bells are bound to the village because of what was done. If you want to stop them, you must break the chain." "How?" She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small brass bell, identical to the ones I'd seen in the clearing. "This is the first bell," she said. "It is the source of their power. If you destroy it, the others will fall silent." I stared at the bell in her hand, its surface gleaming faintly in the light. "Why didn't you do it?" She looked away, her grip tightening on the bell. "Because I was afraid," she said. "But you are stronger than I was. You can end this." I took the bell from her, its weight heavy in my hand. The moment I touched it, the forest seemed to shift, the air growing colder and darker. "Go," she said, "before they stop you." I nodded and turned toward the village, the bell clutched tightly in my hand, but as I stepped into the trees, I heard her voice one last time. "Remember," she said, "the bells demand balance. Be ready to pay the price." The forest seemed alive as I ran, the trees leaning closer, their skeletal branches clawing at the sky. The brass bell felt impossibly heavy in my hand, its smooth surface cold as ice. The air around me was thick and suffocating, heavy with the weight of the bell's demands. Behind me, the sound of chiming grew louder, more frantic, as though the other bells sensed what I was about to do. Shadows slithered along the edges of my vision, and whispers filled the air, faint but urgent. "You can't stop it," they hissed. "The bells are eternal." But I didn't stop. My grandmother's voice echoed in my mind, "Destroy the first bell and the others will fall silent." I didn't know if it would work. I didn't even know how to destroy it. But I had to try. The village was deserted when I emerged from the forest. The snow-covered streets were eerily quiet, the houses dark and lifeless. It was as if Frostwood itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what I would do. I made my way to the church, the brass bell still clutched tightly in my hand. The building loomed over me, its steeple piercing the dark sky like a jagged blade. The door creaked open as I pushed it, the sound echoing in the empty nave. Inside, the air was colder than the forest, and the faint scent of incense lingered, mixing with the metallic tang of the bell in my hand. The smaller bell I had seen before hung in the corner, its surface tarnished and dull. I approached the altar, my breath visible in the frigid air. The first bell seemed to hum faintly in my hand, as though it were alive, reacting to my every movement. "How do I destroy you?" I whispered, my voice trembling. The answer came not from the bell, but from the shadows. "You can't." I spun around, my heart hammering in my chest. The woman from the clearing stood in the doorway, her hollow eyes fixed on me. "You think you can break the chain?" she said, her voice sharp and mocking. "You think you can undo centuries of power?" "I have to try," I said, clutching the bell tighter. She tilted her head, her smile widening. "You don't understand, do you? The bells are not just objects. They are alive. They are the forest. They are the village. Destroying them will not save you. It will unmake everything." Her words sent a chill through me, but I didn't back down. "If that's true, then why are you here? Why do you want to stop me?" Her smile faltered just for a moment. "Because balance must be maintained," she said. "If you destroy the bell, you will pay the price." "What price?" Her expression darkened. "Your life, your soul. The bells will take everything from you, and even then, it might not be enough." I turned back to the altar, ignoring her warnings. My grandmother had trusted me to finish what she couldn't, and I wouldn't let her down. I raised the bell over my head, its weight almost unbearable, and prepared to strike it against the stone. The woman screamed, a sound that pierced through the air like a knife. The shadows surged toward me, their twisted forms clawing at my legs, my arms, my mind. "Stop!" she shrieked. "You don't know what you're doing!" I hesitated, the bell trembling in my grip. Her voice was filled with desperation, and for the first time I wondered if she was telling the truth. "What happens if I destroy it?" I demanded. "The bells will fall silent," she said, her voice shaking. "But so will the village. The forest will take everything. Is that what you want?" I didn't know. My mind raced, weighing the cost of what I was about to do. The villagers had lived under the bell's curse for centuries, paying their price in blood. Could I condemn them to lose everything? Could I sacrifice myself to break the chain? Before I could decide, the first bell began to glow. Its surface pulsed with a faint, golden light, and the sound of chiming filled the church. The other bells had joined in, their song rising in a haunting crescendo. The woman stepped closer, her hollow eyes pleading. "There is another way," she said. "A different balance." "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice barely audible over the bells. "Give yourself to them," she said. "Offer your life, your soul, and they will be appeased. The village will survive, and the bells will fall silent. For a time, She nodded. The balance is never permanent, but it is the only way to save them. My mind reeled. I thought of my grandmother, of the villagers who had disappeared, of the children whose names were etched beneath the bells. How many more would suffer if I didn't act? But could I give my life to the bells, knowing it might only delay the inevitable? The glow from the first bell grew brighter, and the chiming reached a deafening pitch. The shadows closed in, their cold, slimy touch wrapping around my arms and legs, holding me in place. "Choose," the woman said. "The bells will not wait much longer." I took a deep breath, my thoughts racing. If I destroyed the bell, it might end the curse, but it might also destroy the village. If I gave myself to the bells, I could save Frostwood, but at the cost of my own life. I had to choose. I looked at the woman, her face pale and hollow. "Why do you care what happens?" I asked. For a moment, her expression softened, and I thought I saw something human in her eyes. "Because I was like you once," she said. "I thought I could change it. But the bells, they are stronger than we are." Her words sent a shiver through me, but they also steeled my resolve. I turned back to the altar, the brass bell glowing like a small sun in my hands. "I'm sorry," I whispered, though I wasn't sure who I was apologizing to. With all my strength, I brought the bell down against the stone. The sound was unlike anything I had ever heard. It wasn't a chime, but a deafening roar, as though the forest itself was screaming. The glow from the bell erupted in a blinding flash, and I felt the ground tremble beneath my feet. The shadows recoiled, their forms disintegrating into wisps of smoke. The woman let out a guttural scream, her body convulsing as the light engulfed her. And then, everything went still. When I opened my eyes, I was lying on the floor of the church. The bell was gone, its fragments scattered across the stone. The air was heavy with silence, the kind that presses against your ears and fills your chest. I stumbled to my feet, my body aching, and stepped outside. The village was gone. Where Frostwood had stood was now an endless expanse of snow and forest, the cottages and church swallowed by the trees. The air was colder than before, and the sky was a dull, lifeless grey. I was alone. I don't know how long I wandered through the forest, searching for some sign of life. The bells were silent, but their presence lingered, a faint hum in the back of my mind. Eventually I found a clearing where the massive tree had stood. Its branches were bare, the bells gone, but at its base was something new. A single, small bell, gleaming in the snow. I picked it up, its surface warm to the touch. And then I heard it, the faint sound of laughter, distant but growing closer.